The house where I spent my childhood carried the sense of starch and cardamom. For the initial 11 years of my existence, I held an unspoken conviction that I was the daughter my mother had always prayed to receive. This belief wasn't the fleeting fancy of a child that dissolves into laughter with time. Instead, it felt as fundamental and unquestioned as the blue expanse above us. I never articulated it. I simply existed within its embrace. When the reality of my origins and my potential future finally revealed itself, it didn't crash down like a sudden bolt from the sky. It unfolded gradually, like the slow shift of seasons in a sheltered valley, imperceptible at first, yet complete by the moment awareness dawns, leaving the previous chapter behind. I share this account now because I have reached an age where I can confront it steadily, without turning away, and because I have vowed not to pass the remaining days denying that my early life was anything but ordinary. It was far from ordinary, though from within its boundaries, everything seemed perfectly natural. That is the core essence I wish to convey, if I am able. The way an entire existence can form around a profound, unspoken secret. How the young person at its center can cherish those maintaining the secret. And how, ultimately, the revelation does not shatter that affection, even as it subtly shifts everything, much like a minor tremor repositions items on a shelf while leaving every piece intact. My mother's name was Alona. She was 34 at the time of my birth, older than many of the other mothers I would later encounter, and she moved through the world with the quiet poise of someone who had endured losses she chose not to discuss. My father held demanding positions at a paper mill located in a neighboring town and rested for much of the daytime hours when present at home. As a result, during those earliest periods, my universe revolved almost completely around her. Her touch, her tone, the gentle melodies she hummed while preparing meals, the manner in which she secured my hair using a delicate tortoiseshell clasp inherited from her own mother in a distant land I would never see. She clothed me in lightweight cotton garments of muted hues, fabrics laundered so frequently they felt like a second layer of skin. Each morning, she wove my hair into braids. She addressed me with a name absent from my official birth record, although I remained unaware of any such document or the differing designation it bore. The name she chose was Anuk. She once explained it came from a character in a cherished book from her younger days, a tale of a seaside girl attuned to the whispers of the breeze. I adored that name. I cherished its resonance when spoken by her. How it seemed to gentle her expression. The variations in her voice as she uttered it in approval, in mild disapproval, and once when she believed me slumbering, lingering in the threshold and gazing upon me with the intensity reserved for something feared to disappear. Our home stood at the terminus of an extended gravel path, featuring a shaded veranda and a meticulously maintained garden that my mother cultivated with the dedication of fulfilling a solemn vow. Past the garden stretched a meadow of high grasses, followed by a row of evergreen trees, and beyond them lay the broader realm, which I glimpsed mainly via a modest black and white set in the living area and the worn pages of my mother's old periodicals. We lacked nearby companions. My father's family had deep roots in the area, yet most had relocated or passed on, with the survivors appearing only at memorials and holiday gatherings. This seclusion, which I would later recognize as intentional from my mother's side, registered then merely as the natural contour of existence. Certain youngsters mature amid urban complexes, others on agricultural lands. I matured in a serene dwelling alongside a woman whose devotion I sensed in the precise way she fastened my garments. She instructed me to keep my knees aligned when seated. She showed me how to grasp a teacup using both hands until maturity allowed for one. She imparted the terminology for various sewing techniques employed in repairing attire, the method to iron a seam for perfect flatness, and the proper descent of staircases without heels impacting the boards. Once, when I inquired why the males pictured in her magazines escaped such requirements, she regarded me steadily before replying softly that certain children received attentive upbringing while others did not, and I belonged among the fortunate, for which I ought to feel thankful. I did feel thankful. I nodded in agreement. I recall that nod. I recall viewing myself as among the blessed. The initial occasion, I sensed a divergence between my circumstances and those of peers occurred at age 6. My mother had escorted me to the closest village to purchase sewing supplies. The shop, known as Vester's, carried aromas of paper, aged timber, and the mint candies placed near the counter by the proprietor. I wore a green corduroy pinafore atop a cream-colored shirt, my hair arranged in dual plaits secured by coordinating green bows that same morning. An unfamiliar lady stooped to observe me and inquired about my age. Upon answering, she beamed and remarked to my mother, "What a charming young lady. She has inherited your eyes." My mother expressed gratitude, and a surge of pride filled me, for I enjoyed hearing that I shared her eyes. Yet, behind the lady, beside a button display, a lad roughly my age observed me. Clad in pants and a striped top, with hair cut short, his gaze held something puzzling. It lacked hostility or cruel interest. It resembled an attempt to decipher a minor riddle, followed by resignation and a return to the items before him. I set it aside for years afterward. It lingered within me like a dormant seed in the earth, awaiting suitable conditions. That evening during my bath, I questioned my mother on why certain children sported short hair, while others had longer locks. She responded that some guardians lacked the knowledge to properly tend to a child's tresses, and that I must avoid gazing at those whose caregivers had fallen short. I insisted I had not stared. She acknowledged this, but cautioned that others might perceive otherwise, urging vigilance. I remember the bathwater cooling around my limbs as she spoke, and afterward, the familiar enveloping of the towel, tucked securely before she pressed a kiss to my crown. In that instant, my affection for her swelled so intensely, I felt it constrict my throat. There exists a recollection I have retained for ages, its significance unclear until much later. I was around 7. I had been amusing myself in the meadow behind our residence, typically solitary, and had ascended the lowest limb of a modest apple tree emerging crookedly from the turf. From that perch, I could view the rooftop of our home, the edge of the pines, and the distant smokestack of the mill where my father labored. I recall pondering how, from that height, I might resemble a bird, then correcting myself that I appeared instead as a girl in a frock upon a branch, and that any passerby would comment, "See that little girl in the tree," and it would accurately describe me. Then came a subtler notion, fainter than the first, that if the observer had noted, "See that little boy in the tree," it would hold a peculiar validity as well, though I could not explain it. I shook my head to dispel the second idea. I descended with care to preserve my clothing. I remember my mother summoning me for the evening meal, her voice calling a knock seeming to resolve the matter, prompting me to rush toward her without revisiting the tree for quite some time. My father was never harsh toward me, yet he maintained a remoteness typical of men who early on deem certain domestic matters outside their domain. He labored, consumed meals, rested, perused the paper on weekends, repaired damaged porch boards, and swapped spent light bulbs. He never plaited my hair. He never selected my outfits. He never kept vigil during my illnesses. At times he regarded me with an inscrutable look, blending warmth and bewilderment, as if entering a space and forgetting his purpose there. When my mother referred to me as a knock in his presence, he offered no comment. When she attired me for services in a light blue gown with lace detailing and miniature white gloves, he stayed silent. When I once, quite young, clambered onto his lap and sought confirmation of his love, he affirmed, "Of course I do," before gently returning me to the ground in a gesture that even then registered as a limit. I remained ignorant of his knowledge. I could not discern if he possessed any awareness. I knew only of the extended silence between him and my mother, within which I resided, and that probing it was forbidden. I did not attend formal schooling. My mother provided instruction at the kitchen table. Having briefly worked as an educator prior to marriage, she retained her former volumes and demonstrated patience akin to her care for vegetation, consistent watering, orientation toward sunlight. I acquired reading skills promptly. Letters came via chalkboard, numerals through finger counting, and geography via maps of nations whose frontiers would alter before I could travel there. She introduced French expressions, napkin folding, 2 sacred songs, and a nameless lullaby. Notably absent, as I realized only afterward, were lessons on interacting with other youths. When I once inquired about attending school, she described such environments as harsh, particularly for boys, emphasizing her desire to shield me. She pronounced boys, with the inflection reserved for wolves. I absorbed without explicit statement that boys represented a shared apprehension and that I stood apart from them. The initial fracture in this constructed reality was so subtle it nearly escaped notice. I was 8. A county official, a type of wellness inspector, arrived due to an overdue form from my mother. Seated at our table, she posed inquiries regarding immunizations, development, and education. My mother replied with exactitude that struck me even then as performative. The visitor then addressed me. "And how is Anuk feeling today?" I replied, "Fine, thank you." She smiled and jotted a note. Prior to departing, she requested a glimpse of my chamber. My mother's features remained composed, yet her hand upon the table shifted faintly, as if reaching before reconsidering. She consented and guided the woman along the corridor, with me following. I felt an instinctive caution regarding the placement of my belongings on the bed versus the shelves. Once the inspector departed, my mother seated herself in the kitchen and remained mute for an extended period. Eventually, she beckoned. "Come here, Anuk." I approached, and she embraced me with greater intensity than customary, whispering, "We must exercise great caution now. Do you understand?" I affirmed yes, despite my lack of comprehension. Subsequently, visitors diminished. My mother ceased outings to the village for supplies and correspondence. She shifted to postal orders. When my father's cousin, residing 2 hours distant, proposed a birthday visit, my mother declined, citing recent illnesses rendering it unwise, a detail I learned years afterward. At the moment, I perceived only the contracting boundaries of my world, my mother's heightened vigilance toward the drive, and her calls for me to enter from the porch upon rare passing vehicles, regardless of my idle reading. I grasped in the indistinct manner of children that protection from some unspecified threat enveloped me, a threat connected to my own being. I refrained from questioning it, having learned that certain inquiries altered the household atmosphere for days. During this era, I possessed one companion, or an approximation thereof. Her name was Marta, daughter of a woman with whom my mother exchanged correspondence, an old acquaintance from the city. She stayed with us for 2 weeks one summer at age 9, while her parents resolved unspecified troubles. Marta, a year my senior, possessed a tanned, open countenance and laughed readily at matters I found perplexing. She donned shorts, an item absent from my wardrobe, and on her initial afternoon inquired why I lacked them. I explained my mother favored dresses. She shrugged, accepting the peculiarity without further comment. We frolicked in the meadow, constructing a miniature realm from rocks and pine cones.
She
demonstrated whistling via grass blades. She wove flowers into my locks, calling me princess, and I basked in the title without grasping its effortless fit. On the 4th or 5th evening, we shared my bed after my mother set up a portable cot, which Marta disregarded. In the darkness, she asked if I had ever kissed a boy. I said no. She described a dare at a celebration, likening it to the interior of a paper cup. She wondered if I anticipated kissing boys someday. I expressed uncertainty. She inquired, "Well, do you like boys or girls?" I admitted ignorance on both. She fell silent for a while. Then, softly, "I think you're nice, Anuk." Sleep claimed her soon after, or so it seemed. I remained wakeful, eyes fixed upward, and for the first time posed to myself in an unfamiliar inner voice the question of my true nature, beyond my mother's daily affirmations while braiding, beyond the inspector's address. Something deeper eluded me, and that elusiveness stirred an unnamed dread. Upon Marta's departure, I wept for 2 days. My mother attributed it to illness and prepared nourishing soup. She perched on my bedside, smoothing hair from my brow, murmuring, "My sweet Anuk, my little girl." Each utterance of girl evoked a peculiar flutter, like a bird testing wings within my ribcage. Whether seeking escape or entry, I could not say. She detected nothing. Or perhaps she perceived all and chose denial. I have pondered that scene repeatedly since. I have considered whether voicing any questions then might have altered my path entirely. But I stayed silent, pressing my face into the pillow as she continued her soothing. I convinced myself of fatigue, of missing my friend, of nothing amiss. The subsequent fracture arrived at age 10. My paternal grandmother, encountered merely twice before, passed in a hospital within an unseen city. My parents needed to attend the rites. Bringing me proved impossible. My mother offered no explanation, yet I sensed at 10 that funeral attendees remained unaware of my existence in its presented form, and my attendance would provoke unwelcome scrutiny. Thus, my mother took the step she had previously sworn against. She arranged my stay for 3 nights with a woman named Odie, residing across the meadow in a modest home I had glimpsed perhaps 4 times, always distantly while waving from her veranda during drives. Odie, a widow, featured a broad face, gentle low voice, and slightly tremulous hands when serving tea. She dwelt alone with 2 felines and a songbird. My mother prepared a small valise of frocks, sleepwear, brush, and braiding ribbons, escorting me personally across the field, clasping my hand throughout. At Odie's steps, she crouched, hands on my shoulders, instructing. Anuk, listen to me. You must be a very good girl for Odie and refrain from discussing our family. Do you understand? I nodded yes. She searched my eyes as if imprinting the directive. She kissed my brow, rose, exchanged an indecipherable glance with Odie, and retraced her path alone. Odie proved benevolent. She offered sweet pastries and allowed me to nestle in her lap during readings from a vast, illustrated ancient Bible. She passed no judgment on my attire or plates. She posed no family queries. On the second afternoon, however, she led me to her sewing space to repair a nightgown hem. While measuring, pins in mouth, she paused abruptly. Removing the pins, she asked softly, "Child, does your mother ever bring you to a physician?" I replied sometimes. She clarified, "A children's doctor." I stated my mother managed my care. Odie studied me at length, nodded gradually, smiled in the manner of one withholding comment, completed the task, and never referenced it again over the remaining days. Yet that exchange implanted something within me. I lacked vocabulary for it. I knew only that Odie had perceived something, perhaps regarding my form, my posture, my responses, and had identified it while electing silence. When my mother returned, she inquired of Odie with feigned lightness if all had proceeded well. Odie confirmed, praising me as a delightful child. My mother's shoulders eased noticeably, perceptible only to me. We crossed the field homeward, hands linked, and I withheld the sewing room incident. It marked my inaugural withheld confidence from her. As we walked, I sensed it would likely not be the final one. Around then, my physique altered in bewildering ways. My mother had alluded vaguely to feminine maturation, mentioning periodic discomforts and future assistance in preparations. But developments diverged from her descriptions. My previously clear, high voice broke one breakfast, prompting my mother's sharp glance before dismissal as a chill. My shoulders widened. Faint facial hair emerged above my lip, and without explanation, my mother daily wiped my face with a warm cloth redolent of almonds, a mild depilatory sourced by post, akin to her own leg treatments, as I discovered later. Mirror reflections, infrequent due to the sole full-length glass in her chamber, showed a visage growing unfamiliar, which I ascribed to the general process of maturing and becoming strange to oneself. I recall the day comprehension of profound misalignment began. Nearing 11, my mother requested I fetch laundry from the attic. In that warm, arid space scented with cedar and dust, I unlatched a previously untouched trunk. It was unsecured. She likely never anticipated my exploration. Contents included documents, images, and fabric bundles. One photograph depicted my younger mother beside my father cradling an infant swathed in blue, corner embroidered, with what seemed a bear. An official sheet bore seals, parental names, and an unrecognized short masculine name matching my birth date. I stood motionless in the attic, document in hand, for an extended duration. No tears or exclamations came. Instead, a profound calm settled, the serenity of long-suspected truths finally confirmed. I thought with startling lucidity, so that is my name. Then, so that is what I am. Followed by, so that is what she has shielded me from. I restored the paper, shut the trunk, gathered the linens, and ascended. My mother accepted the bundle, thanking me as a nuck. I responded appropriately, retreated to my room, perched on the bed, examined my hands, and reflected on the puzzled boy in the shop, Marta's query on preferences, Odie's sewing room observation, my father's lapside expression. For the first time, I grasped that my life had been a chamber sealed by loving hands, and that I would eventually face the choice to unseal it. I made no choice that day, nor for a considerable while. I strive for candor here, as this aspect often proves most challenging for others to grasp. When nurtured inside a protective veil, particularly one woven from devotion, one does not simply exit upon sighting the barrier. One brushes against it, returns to one's seat, consumes the meal, permits hair braiding, dons the green corduroy pinafore. One employs the bestowed name, for it alone has carried warmth in every utterance. And gradually, imperceptibly, one cultivates a parallel existence within the original. A life composed predominantly of observation. I began noticing I observed my mother's grip firming on my shoulder near outsiders. I observed subject changes when my father alluded to select kin. I observed her insistence on exceptionally long hair, surpassing any in her publications, self-trimmed monthly in the kitchen, clippings collected and incinerated outdoors. I observed selections of loose, yielding garments avoiding cling or emphasis on bodily contours. I observed her monitoring of my consumption. I observed her watchfulness during rest. I observed the almond preparation. I observed her softened speech around me as my voice shifted, as though guarding against influence. And I observed, with inexplicable guilt, that a portion of me resisted any cessation of these patterns. That reluctance terrified me most in the months following the attic discovery. Not the masculine name on the record. Not the blue-blanketed infant image. Those registered as distant facts, biographical details. The aspect that unsettled me on a more personal, deeper level was realizing that the existence I had inhabited, the life as a nuck, filled with frocks, plates, and teacups grasped with both palms, was one I had no desire to abandon. I cherished my name. I cherished the aroma of the almond preparation. I cherished the transformation in my mother's expression whenever she gazed at me, as though I resolved a lifelong inquiry she had carried. I had not yet determined if I qualified as a girl, yet I knew I resisted ceasing to be a nuck. At that stage, I could not discern whether this stemmed from a nuck representing my authentic self or merely the result of conditioning. I lacked the means to distinguish between those possibilities. Even today, I doubt anyone fully can. During the winter of my 12th year, my father fell ill. It started as a persistent cough that worsened. By spring, traversing from the veranda to the mailbox left him needing frequent pauses to recover. My mother cared for him attentively, displaying a gentleness I seldom witnessed. She remained at his bedside, reading newspaper articles aloud. She offered him spoonfuls of soup. Amid this, one afternoon as I delivered a cup of tea to their chamber, placed it on the bedside table, and began to withdraw, my father grasped my wrist. His grip felt friendlier than before. He regarded me extendedly before speaking in an unfamiliar tone. I am sorry. I could not grasp the reason for his apology. Initially, I assumed it concerned his condition, the imposition, or exhausting my mother. I reassured him. It is fine, Papa. He gave a faint shake of his head and repeated, I am sorry. Then he shut his eyes. Without wishing to, I comprehended that he sought forgiveness for something far older and more significant, lacking the energy to elaborate. My mother, positioned in the entrance holding a folded cloth, had overheard, her complexion draining to pallor. He passed away in summer. I was 12. The service occurred in a modest chapel I had never visited, within an unfamiliar settlement. There, I encountered individuals who had known my father prior to his union with my mother. One aunt, a petite woman with piercing blue eyes, drew me aside post-ceremony and examined me closely. She remarked, "You must provide your mother great solace." I replied that I endeavored to. She continued staring. She added, "You resemble your father's lineage, you realize." Almost immediately, my mother materialized at my side, as if attuned to the exchange. She stated, "We ought to depart, Anuk," clasped my hand, and guided me away. The aunt observed our retreat with an inscrutable look I never encountered again, for we never returned to that place. My mother never mentioned that aunt afterward, and I never corresponded with her, though she crossed my mind occasionally in subsequent years. I pondered what she had perceived in me and what she had elected to withhold. Following my father's death, my mother and I resided solely in the dwelling at the gravel path's end. For a period, it seemed as if nothing altered while simultaneously everything transformed. She ceased humming during meal preparation. She no longer cultivated the garden with prior intensity. She took to lingering on the porch for extended durations, eyes fixed on the pine border. When I offered tea, she accepted without eye contact, murmuring thanks so faintly it nearly escaped hearing. She continued plaiting my hair. She continued addressing me as Anuk. She continued selecting my garments, ironing seams, and imparting the minor, impractical refinements she had instilled lifelong. Yet something within her seemed to fray, akin to material worn thin from excessive laundering. I came to sense, without verbal confirmation, that the safeguards she erected around me had also shielded her. With my father absent, we two now occupied a narrative fully known only to her. At 13, I ventured my initial inquiry. I had prepared it over weeks. I selected an evening when fatigue appeared lighter as she repaired a ripped cushion cover beneath the parlor lamp. I positioned myself opposite and asked, "Mama, was I born as I am presently?" She kept her gaze lowered. Her needle continued its rhythm. She responded, "What an odd inquiry, Anuk." I clarified, "I mean, was I always?" She asked, "Always what?" The term refused to emerge. I had contemplated it for months, since the attic and the document bearing the masculine name, yet could not voice it before her. I murmured, "I do not know." I added, "Disregard it." She then raised her eyes, moistened, and stated, "Anuk, some questions are not mere questions. They are injuries, and we do not reopen injuries in this home." She resumed mending. I withdrew to my chamber. I reclined in darkness. I recognized that she knew of my knowledge, and that she silently requested continued pretense of ignorance. The distressing element, one I still partially cannot absolve myself for, is that I complied for a considerable span. I sustained the pretense because it proved simpler than the option, and because of my affection for her, and because the alternative remained undefined. I had encountered no one sharing my circumstances. I was unaware such individuals existed. I lacked terminology. In my limited sphere, only women and men existed, and I had been reared as the former. A document in the attic indicated otherwise. Beyond that lay void, no guide, no vocabulary, no sanction. I wish I could recount discovering a volume that altered everything or a stranger uttering pivotal words. That did not occur. Over following years, I assembled myself fragmentarily, quietly, through gradual small denials and small affirmations that coalesced into form. The initial minor denial involved the almond preparation. At 14, I grasped its purpose and harbored quiet, persistent resentment toward the daily ceremony. My mother's fabric on my face each dawn, her fingers carrying traces of her hand lotion. Her gaze during the act, now clear as an effort to restrain something. One morning I declared, "I can manage it myself, Mama." She halted midway, cloth suspended. She said, "Oh." She said, naturally. She passed it to me. I cleansed my own face. Thereafter, each morning I did so independently. And, progressively, I did it with diminishing thoroughness. By 15, I abandoned the cream completely, allowing a gentle dark line to trace my jaw. My mother, observant of all, uttered nothing. I perceived a boundary established between us, one she permitted me to establish, representing a form of affection I had not realized she could extend. The initial minor affirmation proved more difficult to identify. At 15 and a half, my mother ventured to town for the day, a rarity, and I found myself solitary in the residence for the first time I could recall. I refrained from the action I had envisioned in private imaginings over years, reopening the trunk, re-examining the document, viewing the name, and attempting utterance in vacant space. Instead, I entered my mother's sleeping quarters. I positioned myself before the full-length reflection. I studied myself. I wore a lengthy gray gown with white trim. My hair hung in a relaxed plait along my spine. My countenance, freed from the almond treatment, appeared under that afternoon's illumination like that of a young man in feminine attire. I did not avert. I did not weep. I remained, observing that face extensively. In a tone so subdued the space scarcely registered it, I said, "Hello." I employed neither name. Not a Nook. Not the one from the record. I greeted as if encountering another for the initial time, someone familiar across my lifespan, yet never formally introduced. I reflected that this was the individual I had evaded, and the one my mother had concealed, and the one I would eventually need to confront. Then the vehicle sounded on the gravel. I returned to my room, settled with a volume, and upon my mother's return with provisions, I resumed being a Nook. She kissed my crown, and I withheld that in her chamber. Before her glass that afternoon, someone had offered greeting. The interval from 15 to 18 comprised the period of existing as dual selves, during which I conducted most introspection, concealment, and maturation. My mother, who had prohibited conventional schooling, finally consented at 16 to correspondence studies via a program located in one of her periodicals. I completed assignments at the kitchen table of my initial education. I composed compositions on text she selected. I dispatched them in manila packets and received returns with crimson notations from an unseen instructor. Through these studies, I first engaged mature fiction. In one such novel concerning a seaside family, I encountered within a brief, nearly concealed passage midway through a chapter, a portrayal of a figure born one manner, yet existing another. The segment was concise. It lacked intensity. It depicted the figure proceeding to market with a basket. Yet a particular expression regarding a childhood appellation different from the current struck me electrically. I reread it. I read it a third occasion. I sat at the kitchen table opposite my mother, who shelled vegetables, and sensed the entire framework of my internal world tilt slightly. I sensed her glance upward. I lowered mine to the pages and advanced as though undisturbed. That night sleep evaded me. For the first time, I recognized others in the world who had navigated similar paths. I still lacked the term. The text avoided it, yet a single sentence sufficed. A sentence signified non-isolation. A sentence indicated someone had documented a parallel existence without deeming it excessively bizarre for mention. A sentence implied whatever I embodied could receive designation. And if nameable, then livable. I remained sleepless through the night. I observed dawn filtering through my window, shifting the ceiling from dark to ashen to luminous. I formed a modest vow to myself, though its full scope remained unclear. I vowed, I believe, to cease self-deception. I stopped short of vowing to cease deceiving others. That commitment required far greater time, carried heavier price, and arrived incrementally. I initiated tentative minor adjustments. When my mother worked outdoors, I would enter her chamber, draw hair away from my features, and examine myself in her reflection absent the braid or bow's softening effect. I would murmur phrases in a lowered register unlike my table voice. I would posture differently, knees separated, elbows upon thighs, mirroring men in antique images. I would grasp items as my father had, a single-handed cup rather than dual, a volume spread wide across my palm. Then, anticipating her return, I would reverse all. Repla hair. Readjust attire. Resume knees together seating at the table. Sip tea with both hands. Each instance, I convinced myself it constituted mere play, mere inquisitiveness, that I harbored no genuine desire. Each time the deception weakened slightly, and each time weariness with it increased. The pivotal moment, if one must designate it despite skepticism towards singular pivots, occurred during my 17th summer. A youth from the county maintenance crew arrived to mend a collapsed fence segment bordering the meadow. My mother, averse to outsiders on the grounds, monitored from the kitchen pane with crossed arms. At her direction, I carried him water, as refusal would seem discourteous. He accepted the glass, expressed gratitude, regarded me at length, and inquired without malice, with mild, perplexed amiability, "Ma'am, might I pose a question?" I consented. He asked, "Are you a boy or a girl?" I recall sunlight upon my scalp. I recall the empty platter's heft in my grasp. I recall distinctly lacking fury. Instead, profound, nearly tranquil interest in my forthcoming response arose. I answered, "My mother declares I am a girl." He nodded deliberately, as if this proved entirely logical. He said, "Very well, ma'am." Appreciated the water. He returned the vessel. He resumed fencing. I returned indoors. My mother awaited at the threshold, demanding, "What did he say?" I replied, "He thanked me for the water." She studied me extensively. She said, "Anak." I affirmed, "Yes, Mama." She declared, "He will not return." I agreed. Yet internally, something unfurled, for I had heard my voice state, "My mother declares I am a girl." Not an assertion of personal identity. I noted the distinction. From then onward, I would detect it invariably. That fall, my mother's condition declined gradually, escalating over the subsequent 2 years. Her once steady hands developed tremors. Her formerly keen eyes fatigued by evening. Prolonged reading by lamplight became impossible. Full afternoons in the garden exceeded her capacity. She requested tasks formerly self-performed, and I complied. Neither addressed the role inversion explicitly, yet it manifested in her observation of me hoisting heavy cookware, in her acceptance of my carrying the linen basket upstairs unopposed. During this phase, at 18 while she was 52, the final extended confrontation of my youth unfolded. It resembled less argument than protracted sparse silence interspersed with speech. It originated, of all places, at the kitchen table concerning the correspondence program. I had finished the final modules. A certificate accompanied them. The unknown instructor included a gracious note recommending application to a modest urban college offering aid for countryside applicants. I presented the letter to my mother. I placed it before her. I stated, "Mama, I wish to attend." She perused it. She reread. She set it aside. She said, "Anak, we have discussed this." I countered, "We have never discussed this." She replied, "We have in indirect manners." I insisted, "I desire to go." She asked, "And what will you do there, solitary in a city absent me?" Before restraint, I responded, "I will discover who I am." She regarded me steadily. Her features remained unaltered. She inquired, "And who do you believe yourself to be, Anak?" I admitted, "I do not know." I added, "That is precisely why. I do not know. And you have never permitted discovery." She paused extensively. She creased the letter. She smoothed it. She refolded. Then, in a voice so exhausted I could scarcely endure, she said she had acted as she deemed right. I replied, "I know, Mama." She countered, "You do not know." I urged, "Then inform me." She looked, and for the first time I witnessed her fear of me. Not of potential actions. Fear of potential knowledge. Fear of the attic document. Fear of Odie's sewing space. Fear of the fence youth. Fear that she had constructed our shared existence from one distant hospital decision, and that existence now concluded regardless of her intent, and she lacked means to release it. Quietly, she revealed, "I lost a child before you." This was unknown to me entirely. She specified a daughter. She said the infant survived 4 days. She attempted. When you arrived, I could not, and halted. Completion proved unnecessary. In that instant, I grasped totality and void simultaneously. I grasped her lifelong mourning. I grasped her love as substitution, with substitution itself a variety of love. I grasped her inability to desire me as I presented, and thus desiring me transformed. I had permitted it through affection and ignorance of alternatives. I stayed seated opposite at the table. I did not approach or touch. I said, "Mama, I am not her." She shut her eyes. She affirmed, "I know." I continued, "I never was." She repeated, "I know." I stated, "I do not yet know what I am, yet I am not her." She reopened her eyes.
She regarded me.
She said, "I know, Anuk." That marked the final unhesitant use of Anuk. Thereafter, whenever employing the name, a brief hesitation preceded it, as if deliberate selection rather than default. That hesitation itself initiated a form of liberation for us both. I deferred the city that year. I remained. Her hands deteriorated further. She required assistance with nightgown fastenings. She needed aid brushing her own tresses. A peculiar tender symmetry marked the role reversal, felt by both, unspoken because vital matters had never been voiced, and we lacked practice initiating now. Yet minor shifts occurred. She permitted hair trimming. Not fully, merely to shoulder length. She performed it herself in the kitchen one Sunday. Afterward, she cradled a lock in her palm as if a small deceased creature, then wrapped it in paper and stored it with her needles and fasteners. She allowed trousers indoors. Exclusively indoors, fashioned from an old pair of my father's preserved in storage for unexamined reasons. She modified them personally, her quivering hands slower. When I first donned them and stood before her, she observed lengthily before saying, "You resemble him," meaning my father. I could not discern compliment, sorrow, or effusion. I refrained from asking, as her expression revealed her own uncertainty. During that year of attending her, I first contemplated myself with a pronoun differing from hers. I voiced it not aloud. I inscribed it nowhere. Yet mornings, prior to donning the gown she still favored for table time, prior to plaiting hair she preferred braided, prior to greeting in our mutual cautious tone, I would recline briefly, eyes closed, and internally form one sentence in the inner voice first heard beside sleeping Marta. The sentence employed the alternate pronoun. I allowed it to reside within, noting its sensation. Each dawn it felt incrementally less alien. Each dawn it felt increasingly inherent. She passed in spring of the year I reached 20. It was gradual. It lacked violence. She diminished and quieted daily. One morning she simply did not rouse. I sat beside her bed extensively before notifying others. I clasped her chilled hand and spoke aloud in a voice never used in her company. "Thank you." I spoke in the tone practiced in her reflection since 15. I spoke in my voice. I added, "I am sorry." I added, "I forgive you." I added, "I hope you forgive me." Then I rose and contacted the county woman. Proceedings commenced. The service was intimate and subdued, in the same small chapel where my father rested 8 years prior. I wore a gown for her sake. I wore plaited hair. I permitted the sparse attendees to address me as Anuk. I stood at the graveside as they lowered her. Simultaneously, immense sorrow threatened to engulf me alongside a peculiar slender easement. Guilt over the easement lingered long afterward. Eventually it faded as I recognized the easement concerned not her passing but conclusion of 20 years shared silence. I remained in the house one additional summer. I organized her possessions. I located the attic trunk. I opened it. I examined the document with the boy's name. This time I read it aloud in the vacant home. The name felt foreign on my tongue, like a term long unvoiced. I reached no decision on adopting it then. I resolved only to cease fearing it. I found the blue-blanketed infant photograph. I noted the corner-embroidered bear. For the first time I understood the infant as myself, the bear selected likely by my father, who on that hospital day believed he welcomed a son. I pocketed the image. I retain it still. In autumn, I departed. I sold the property, or facilitated its sale, took the modest proceeds, traveled to the city my mother had long dreaded, enrolled belatedly at the small college once offering aid, and commenced the gradual, commonplace labor of entering the world as a person. I will omit detailing that chapter, as it constitutes another tale belonging to another emerging self. One still developing. One committing numerous errors. One continuing to absorb that vocabulary for my condition existed, others employed it, and I held permission to. I will convey only its outline. I encountered those who traversed comparable experiences. I encountered those untouched by it who loved me regardless. I encountered those unable to accept and release them with less sorrow than anticipated, having grieved abundantly early in that secluded gravel path home. I bypassed the boy's name from the record. I bypassed a Nuck as well. Eventually, I selected my own, belonging to none prior, resonating with the individual met in my mother's reflection that greeting afternoon. I withhold it here as it is personal, and this narrative concerns the path to claiming one. I chose it in my late 20s within a modest urban apartment my mother would not recognize. When first voicing it before another, someone affectionate who had patiently awaited my readiness, I wept differently than at either parent's rights. I finally comprehended that mourning and liberty can manifest as identical emotion in varied guises. Over years, I have reflected extensively on my mother's actions. I have considered if cruelty, affection, dread, sorrow, or interplay I may never fully label. I have considered the daughter who lived 4 days, whose name remains unknown as my mother could not disclose. I have considered my father's deathbed apology for the unspeakable. I have considered Odie in her sewing space, the funeral aunt with keen blue eyes, the fence youth, Marta in darkness inquiring preferences, the shop boy pondering over buttons. I have concluded each glimpsed facets of me I had not yet recognized in myself. Some offered small exits in their ways, others deemed it not their role, all ultimately striving within a narrative none possess language for. Anger toward my mother has dissipated. That required considerable time. For years, it smoldered subtly, invisible externally, complicating trust in caregivers. I resisted care. I linked nurturing with secrecy, gentleness with price. I recoiled from kind words by women her.